It's my pleasure to welcome you to our first session. We have three speakers. The first speaker is Tomas Sobotka, who is a senior researcher at the Vienna Institute of Demography and at the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital. At the moment, he's coordinating an ERC-funded grant focusing on fertility reversals and reproduction in contemporary Europe. And his topic of today will be oocyte cryopreservation as an insurance strategy, a socio-demographic viewpoint. Thomas?
Good morning. I'm delighted to be the first speaker in the first session of the first symposium on oocyte on social use of oocyte cryopreservation. That's an honor, and it was quite a brave decision as well by the organizers, because honestly I don't know so much about oocyte cryopreservation as I'm a demographer by background, but I will try my best to give a demographic perspective on this issue. To start with, I would like to quote something from quite a popular magazine, The Vogue, where one article on the subject said that stopping the biological clock through egg freezing has long been the ultimate feminist fantasy. So that might be a little bit of an overstatement, but it illustrates very well the discussion and also the excitement about this whole range of new possibilities which egg freezing seems to offer to women with respect to their reproductive decisions. I will talk quite a bit about birth trends in rich countries, and in the last 30 years they have been dominated by childbearing postponement. Women and men were waiting longer and longer and shifting births to later and later time in their lives. Some demographers even call this as a postponement transition. And some first evidence, first data for the last years suggests that in many rich countries this trend has further accelerated during the recent economic recession. It has almost come to the end in most rich countries around the years 2005 to 2008, but now it's back and women and couples are postponing children again. Spain and Switzerland are the champions of postponed motherhood because these are perhaps the only two countries globally where women are already just over 30 years old on average when they have their first child. So it's really already quite a late timing of childbearing in this part of the world. Obviously, there is a conflict between economic and social rationale which makes it for most couples advantageous to postpone childbearing, and biological and health rationale, which essentially stipulates that it's good to have children quite early in life. We demographers sometimes talk about the stretching of the life course because people live ever longer. The life course has been extended, and people have been postponing many life transitions, such as finishing education, finding a partner, marrying, and many other transitions up to the time of retirement. But up to recently, this hasn't been matched with their ability to shift reproduction. Menopause constituted quite a fixed and unmovable deadline for most women, or for all women, with respect to their possibility to reproduce. And social egg freezing seems to offer them the opportunity to shift this boundary to some extent. We know from our demographic and from sociological and other research that there have been many different forces which have been jointly pushing women and men towards having children ever later in life. And I list some of these forces here on this slide, but the key factor among them was the expansion of higher education, especially university education among women, and also delayed economic independence, delayed start of working life, delayed time when people have a secure job position. And this is again something which is even accentuated by the recent recession, where many even highly educated young people simply cannot find a job. And this is, of course, not a good situation for anything to do with family decisions. There are many other factors which make it advantageous for people to have children late in life. And one of the interesting findings which I would just like to highlight is that even the happiness research found out that couples who have children relatively later in life, say after the age of 30, are more happy than those who have children earlier in life. This childbearing postponement, of course, implies uncertainty and risk of involuntary sterility. Up to now, the options which couples facing infertility had were not all very attractive. They could, of course, choose to remain childless, which can be quite stressful if you really desperately want to have a child. They could go for an IVF or ICSI, the traditional one, but there is very low success rate, as you know, after the age of 40, and it's also associated with high costs and psychological stress because you have to try many cycles. They could use donated oocytes, but the obvious drawback of this is that the child will not be carrying the genes of the mother. Or they could go for adoption, but we know that this is often for many couples the decision of the last resort after they have exhausted other options they have. So is cryopreservation a solution? Here I would like to discuss briefly three main issues. I would like to give you some illustrations of the rising importance of childbearing at late reproductive ages. So this is where my main subject area is, and this is where we have plenty of data and evidence. Then I will talk on social egg freezing, on potential demand and use, and this is where we have much, much less data and evidence, as has already been said before. And then I will also try to put together, emphasize some of the forces which will limit the spread of social egg freezing in the future. So I start with some evidence on the rising importance of childbearing at late reproductive ages. First of all, different surveys on childbearing desires and intentions clearly show that women after the age of 35 increasingly plan to have a child in the future. One illustration, for instance, for the US, at age 35-39, only 3% of women wished to have a child in the future in 1980, but already 10% in 1998. A rise by a factor of 3. In Austria, the increase was from 6% in 86 to 15% in 2006. Again, an increase roughly by a factor of 3. And there is a very strong differentiation by parity, that is by the number of children women already have. And this differentiation shows very, very clearly that women who are still childless at these ages, 35, 39, they have an enormous increase in the share of them who say that they would like to have a child in the future. Now, imagine they are on average about 37 years old. And at this age, about 1/3 of US women back in 1998, so that's already 15 years ago, and almost 40% of Austrian women who are still childless in 2006, they said, we would like to have a child in the future. So there is a huge pool of women who really postpone childbearing, well, not towards the limits, but close to the limits. We know the same evidence from the trends in fertility rates after age 35, where we observe a reversal of long-term decline in the 1980s. So up to the 1980s, because people were having smaller and smaller families, and they were not having any more 5 or 6 or 7 kids, fertility rates, birth rates have been declining at ages over 35 and over 40. This has reversed because women and men postpone childbearing, and this reversal is most prominent, again, with respect to first births. As this graph illustrates, it shows the share of first birth rates after the age of 35 in different European countries on the total fertility rates. And you see, it was very, very tiny, very small in all countries I looked at back in 1970s and 1980s, when we observed something like 3% of first birth rates at those ages 35 plus. However, the increase after that time was enormous, and Spain is an example of the sharpest increase out of all countries I saw some evidence on. One almost has doubts about Spanish data when you see this green line going up and reaching almost 20% recently. In other countries, it's more like close to 10% or even below, but even that, the increase is enormous. We know, of course, the evidence also from popular press about the pushing of the age limits of childbearing, and this is a Spanish woman who had twins at the age of almost 67 and 18 years after she had menopause. Unfortunately, she had died a few years later, so that's also one unlucky illustration of some of the risks of having children very, very late in life. And then we have plenty of evidence on assisted reproduction and also on the surveys of infertility, sterility, and impaired fecundity. I think you are quite aware of many of these figures. Maybe I would just like to quote one for the US, which says that 39% of married childless women in the US at age 35, 39 face some sort of impaired fecundity, and it's almost half of the childless married women at age 40 to 44. Also, when in the US there was a survey looking at the split of currently childless women, whether their childlessness is voluntary, involuntary, or temporary, meaning that they are just postponing childbearing. At ages 40-44, it's about 4 women out of 10, according to more recent surveys, who say that their childlessness is involuntary, that they wanted to have a child, but for infertility reasons, most of all, they couldn't. So that's another illustration of the number of women who wanted or planned to have a child late in life, and for many reasons, including especially infertility, they couldn't manage. The evidence on assisted reproduction shows a continuous and sharp increases of its use at ages 40+, despite limited success rates. However, we are facing quite limited data availability from many countries and incomplete coverage. Some articles estimate that the costs of having children with traditional ART, so not using donor eggs, are very high. One study quotes 753,000 euros as a cost per one live birth for a woman who starts IVF procedure after age 45. Of course, it's late. And that was one of the reasons there was a shift to use donor oocytes. And we see quite a strong increase. Spain is one of the countries where there has been sharp rise in the use of donor oocytes, especially among women aged 40+. And that also means that assisted reproduction has increasingly contributed to the observed increase in the number of births and pregnancies at ages 40+. Just looking at the estimate, I didn't have precise data, so I had to use some assumptions. But looking at the estimate of how many live births and how many first live births in Spain after the age of 40 were born after the use of assisted reproduction, the trend is quite amazing again. And the most recent estimate for 2010 is that about 20% of live births after age 40 were following the assisted reproduction, and about 15% followed oocyte delivery, donor oocyte, sorry. Now I turn to social egg freezing, potential demand and potential use of social egg freezing. Women who delay childbearing for a little bit too long, of course, face difficult choices and difficult decisions. And the clear question is whether social egg freezing can provide an alternative and push the boundaries of reproductive ages. Can it become some sort of a win-win strategy to many couples who would like to have children later in life? It seems that if it may offer success rates which are similar to donated oocytes, and at the same time allow women using their own oocytes, their own genetic material, that would be really a great advantage. But as I already said, we still have too few data to analyze long-term success rates of social egg freezing and its potential negative consequences. Also, the costs, ethical issues, legal regulations may hamper its use, and we know quite little up to now. So I decided to make a thought exercise, a sort of experimental exercise, looking if we can have ideal conditions for social egg freezing. And ideal conditions would include things like low costs or reimbursements to women from health agencies, high success rates, high acceptance among the population, good access to the treatment, many clinics available. How many women might consider, first of all, getting their oocytes collected and cryopreserved, and second, use them to undergo assisted reproduction later in life? I had to be quite inventive, so these estimates are based on combining diverse data sources on infertility, birth intentions, use of assisted reproduction, success rates of assisted reproduction by age, partly also by the number of children women have, and I was facing all the way incomplete data, especially with respect to assisted reproduction. Therefore, I had to make different assumptions, and I made a separate analysis for first birth, so for women who are childless. I looked, these models and estimates correspond to contemporary patterns of Spanish childbearing, especially Spanish first births, Spanish fertility rates, and Spanish ART patterns. Infertility data I used from the US because I had data by 5-year age groups on infertility or pregnancy difficulties among women. And on birth intentions, I worked with Austrian data because then we have nice data about trends in the number of women who plan to have children in the future. I tried to use several alternative scenarios showing how many women may use social egg freezing. So you should treat this as very tentative and rough estimates. More sort of to stimulate discussion than something really precise which we would be able to nail down. So first of all, how many women might ever make use of their oocytes in order to get pregnant? So I only consider social egg freezing, and which is linked to fertility postponement, to the desire to have children later in life. And I am not looking at women who are facing some medical conditions, such as ovarian cancer, for whom it's very, very clear they need to get the treatment, and that's for a different conference or for a different discussion. And I try to look at the maximum estimates of potential demand. Imagine, first of all women would have a stock of cryopreserved eggs already, which they could use. How many of them might eventually make a use of the technology of assisted reproduction? And I start from the lowest possible estimates. First, how many women would use it just if it would replace all donor oocytes? Because we know that this is also not preferred option among most couples to get donor oocytes. Almost everyone would prefer to have their own biological material, their own eggs. And then the second, what if it replaces all ART treatments after age 40? So these estimates are close to 1%, 0.7%, the first one 1.4%, the second one. Then I looked how many women might make use of this if everyone who would face difficulties achieving pregnancy or live birth after the age of 40 would make use of assisted reproduction with unfrozen oocytes. And then these estimates range between 1 and 2.4% when we look only at women who are still childless. If we include all women, this estimate would range between 2.7 and 5%. So they are increasing quite a bit already. And if we take into account that the pattern of plans to have a child late in life may still shift, more and more women may really enter this sort of, I don't want to say dangerous, but problematic age of 40 without having kids. So maybe in the future there will be by 50% more, then these estimates shift by about 50% again, and we have range from 1 to 7.5%. Now, how many women should consider or might consider storing their oocytes, getting their eggs frozen? So the idea is that this has to be done quite early in life to have really good quality oocytes frozen and to have good chances to get pregnant later in life. And again, I use different models with different assumptions. So first of all, what if only every woman who would like to get pregnant after the age of 40 would try to get her eggs frozen? And the estimates would range between 2 and 7%, depending on whether the age of childbearing will shift further or whether it will stay where it is now, and depending on what model and method I used for estimations. If I shift from childless women, if I include every woman who would ever like to get pregnant after the age of 40, these numbers shift again, and they range from 8 to 12.5%. Finally, if women would really like to be super cautious, so even women who would like to have their first child after age 35, and all women who would like to have any child after age 40 are included, again, these estimates shift to much higher, and we would conclude that between something like 17 and 28, 29, 30% even of women might consider getting their oocytes frozen, cryopreserved earlier in life. Now, this is the theory, this is the maximum potential demand for the technology, and the real world, of course, will limit this demand quite a bit. There are many forces which will act as limiting factors to this demand and to the spread of this new technology. One of them, I already mentioned, uncertainty about future long-term success rates, potential pregnancy complications, health risks. Too few data are still available on that. The other thing is cost. The costs of retrieval, storage, and possible IVF use in the future are not negligible. One study estimated that one child with social egg freezing would cost $24,500. Another study with very different assumptions came up to $1,035,000. For sure, it will be less in the future as the technology matures, but the costs are a big factor. Success is not guaranteed. Some women will never achieve pregnancy using social egg freezing. Many others will easily achieve natural pregnancy, and they may think it's a waste of investment with a hindsight. There is a lot of stress surrounding the technology. In some countries, there may be limited acceptance of this new technology. An online survey in Belgium, admittedly, it's already several years ago when the technology was really about to start, found that only 3% of respondents were ready to jump up on this new technology, and 28% would say, well, maybe they would think about that. Another problem is that early decisions are necessary for later successful outcomes. So ideal age, as far as I know, for social egg freezing is about 30 for harvesting or collecting the eggs. But at that time, many women are still uncertain whether they would like to have children later in life. Economists also talk about the effect of discounting the future. If you smoke when you are 20, you don't really care that you get cancer when you are 60 or 70. And this may also be the factor with social egg freezing. When women are 30, they may often not think about what happens when they are 40, if they would like to have a child when they are 40 or 45. And also there is quite some ignorance about infertility and the risks of not achieving pregnancy. And ethical concerns, which will be discussed, I thought just that I would like to highlight, especially unequal access. Since this is quite costly, women with low income and from disadvantaged social groups may have difficulties in accessing this technology, and also there are still potential pregnancy and health complications among old mothers who try to have children after the age of 45 or even 50. So some final discussion and highlights of some points. It seems that assurance, as it has been called in some of the popular articles in popular magazines, appears to be a strategy which gives couples some extra breathing space, as has been also written in one article on the subject. You can feel a little bit more comfortable about postponing children if you store your eggs and if you have this sort of second option, second strategy to use if you don't achieve natural pregnancy. Women may be gaining high chances of achieving pregnancy with their own oocytes for the first time. And the number of potential users is really big. Of course, potential users, that's important to emphasize. So it's likely that this technology will replace much of the traditional ART use at high reproductive ages. It's also very likely that the use of donor oocytes will decline as a result of this new technology. And it may be considered in the future in conjunction with the assessments of ovarian reserve among women after the age of 30. clearly there is a potential huge market and vast opportunities for specialized clinics with cutting-edge technology and staff to go and start and use this new technology, although, of course, with care and caution. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions? If there are no questions, I will ask one myself. As a demographer, you mentioned that one of the main reasons why women postpone, or one of the main explanations, is extended higher education. Now, one of the remarks that are frequently made regarding social freezing is that you should do something about the social causes. Now, as a demographer, do you see a possibility of reversing this trend?
Personally, I don't see a possibility of reversing this trend. Well, there are small possibilities with respect to the fact that in some countries, young people take too long time to complete education. We know from surveys that nowadays people conceive education as very, very incompatible with childbearing, partly because at the time when you study, your income is usually very low, and having some sort of economic security, decent income, own flat, mostly also own car, and some other feeling of achieving secure economic conditions is for most couples a clear precondition before they consider having a child. So this really doesn't go well with education, and almost every survey tells us that people perceive being in education as incompatible with having children. Of course, it would make no sense to push people back to the past and say, don't go to the university, don't study. But it may make sense in some countries where the studies among young people, and I think Italy and Spain may be the examples, but even Nordic countries are the examples of that courses which should take 4 or 5 years, many people take 6 or 7 or 8 years to finish the education. And nowadays, this is unfortunately combined in many, many countries with very precarious economic situation among young adults, which again postpones by many years the time when they will achieve economic independence. So that's an extra layer which is now added to that if you finish your studies, you cannot get a job. This is again not a situation when most people would like to have a child. So strong reversal I don't see. Some small steps can be perhaps done.
Okay, thank you. Questions?
Thomas, I thank you for your wonderful speech. Please, a question. Thomas.
Don't run yet.
Do you think that we should propose a campaign to inform patients about social egg freezing, health, public health, or during a gynecologist visit?
Again, I'm not a specialist from the field. I'm not a gynecologist, or I'm not I'm not a specialist in reproductive medicine. But from my understanding, I would say probably no at this point, because, as I said, we have so little precise data, and so little has been published on all the success rates, risks, and potential troubles involved in social egg freezing, that advising patients is a little bit premature when we often don't even have precise evidence what we should tell them. And it would be different if there are many patients who already come with a question, because many people will sure read in the media, and this would be a topic which will not disappear from public debates and from the media. So they will be coming to specialized clinics, to you, and they will ask you, can we go for this? And then, of course, you should give them all the information you have and all the good and sensible advice you have. That's clear.
If there are no further questions, I think it's time to move on to the second speaker.